Valerie, congratulations and thank you, because you and your staff have certainly inspired lots of us. I start all my lectures with the same sentence, which is that I call most of my lectures objects of a passion, because it's objects that form the nexus of my writing, my curatorial and my teaching practices. And as this paper will demonstrate, these practices are inextricably entwined. Teaching is informed actively by curatorial practice, and teaching inspires curatorial practice too. Throughout my career, I've taught within museum and university contexts, shockingly for over 30 years. I've worked in museums continuously since 1987, and for 13 of those years I've had collections responsibilities. And all the time you're working in a museum and obviously in a university environment, you're teaching. But teaching fashion curation is a relatively new discipline. And so what is teaching fashion curation? It's the teaching the specificities of working with fashion and dress in curatorial contexts. And I've been doing this since 2001. Initially, I was invited by Rebecca Arnold to teach a one-term course on her dress history course at Central St Martin's. And in a term, you can't do much, but I taught students to critically evaluate fashion exhibitions and how to develop a proposal of their own. You have two core things that you have to do. One is that you have to identify an original area for investigation. You have to obviously select objects, and then you have to articulate what your distinctive curatorial interventions are going to be. In 2004, London College of Fashion introduced a fashion curation MA with Alistair O'Neill as the course leader, and Judith Clark and I were his core teaching staff. 2 years later, Alistair left LCF and went to St Martin's and took over Rebecca's job, and Judith and I became joint course leaders. Subsequently, Judith's been sole course leader, and in 2017, Geoffrey Horsley was appointed. Our MA runs from October to November the following year. We generally take about 10 students, approximately half of whom are international, usually 80 to 90% are female, and they tend to fall into two age groups: students who've come straight from doing their degree, or students who mid-career either want to upskill or change their career direction. Our course provides students with a grounding in museology and curatorial practices, and our core focuses upon critiquing and creating fashion exhibitions. We often talk in terms of distinctive practices. We talk about writing, we talk about curating, and we talk about teaching, often as if they're really quite separate. And I started to try and think about, what's the relationship between my teaching and writing and curatorial practices, because to me they just feel like what I do. They're inextricably entwined, they interrelate. And so I created this document, which was designed by Sid Shelton, and after loads and loads of scrambling diagrams, I identified what had been the core objects of my passion, or areas of my passion, for the last 4 or 5 years, and I gave each of them a number 1 to 5. I then made a list of all the writing I've done in the last 4 or 5 years, and the exhibitions I've done in the last 4 or 5 years, the teaching I do on the MA and my PhD students, and I gave each of them a number 1 to 5, how they related to the distinctive passions. And as you can see, there are masses of overlaps. So this paper, I'm going to take you on some of the journeys where these practices collide. This is the store at Brighton Museum. On the MA, I run a 15-week unit called Collect Recollect, which explores practices of collecting dress, interpreting objects and collections. And the programme comprises multiple learning experiences. It takes the form of lectures, seminars, lots of site visits, object handling and material culture analysis. And I give the students workshops on critical writing skills, on telling stories with objects, and basic mannequin dressing skills. And the evaluation of the course comprises a seminar and a rigorous academic essay. As I say, lots of the weeks we go out on trips, and one of them is to Brighton Museum, which is on the south coast of England. It's got really good collections of fine and decorative arts, amongst other things, and a good fashion collection. And we go to look at this collection in the context of it being a regional collection, a local museum that's actively embedded in the community. And Martin Pell, the fashion curator, takes the students into the store, talks to them about what's distinctive about the collection, gets out objects for them to look at. And then in the afternoon, he teaches them an inexpensive, fairly fast and effective way of padding and dressing mannequins. And this is this year's students learning to cover a mannequin with a jersey top and to pad it to fit a particular garment. In 2013, Martin invited me to work as the external consultant on a collections review of the museum's dress collection. And this is a museological document that involves examining some 10,000 objects, and we also brought in more external specialists. And it's a museological document, and the aim of it is to identify what you perceive at that particular point in time to be the strengths and weaknesses of the collection, how that collection's used, how it interfaces with other collections in the museum, and how it relates to dress collections throughout the UK and the world. We certainly spent 2 days a week for a year looking at objects and wrote a big, thick document making recommendations for the future. Oh, sorry, I've got an image missing. One of the recommendations was that a PhD student should be developed to work on the Le Ballet collection, which the museum housed. And the other was that Martin's been collecting LGBTQ dress for some time, but there was also another group in Brighton who were collecting it, and that dispersed. So one of the recommendations was that Brighton's a city with a large LGBTQ community, and that one of the things the museum really should do is to actively collect in that area. And so our Centre for Fashion Curation won Heritage Lottery funding. The bid was partly written by Ben Wyman, a former MA student, who's now our centre manager and also one of our PhD students. And we developed a bid called Wear It Out, which involved training young people, including some of our former MA students, to work closely with Martin and colleagues, firstly to collect objects, interpret them, undertake oral history training, and interview people to stage the exhibition, which was called Queer Looks. And the second project was that Brighton Museum's got a lot of one person's clothes, sort of groups of clothes belonging to one person or donated by one person. And one of those people was the artist Gluck, Hannah Gluckstein, who wanted to be known as Gluck, who lived locally and later in life presented the museum with a collection of clothes that had been worn by the women Gluck loved and some of the items that the artist had worn personally. And so we staged an exhibition and invited a former student, Jeff Horsley, to come in and work with us. So this was the book we did, and this was one of Gluck's smocks. Working on the collections review gave me the idea to write to Valerie Steele to inquire whether I could guest edit a special issue of Fashion Theory on collectors' collections and practices of collecting dress. And also, there's a big body of work on collection studies, but I wanted to explore how and if dress is distinctive from other media. We teach our students, we're dedicated to teaching them. Our course is very, very specific. No one stumbles into it. We're obsessive, and I think our students are obsessive. And our commitment often extends until after they've left as well. And so for this special issue, I mentored 4 of my ex-students who'd written essays on Collect, Recollect to write 4 short essays for this special issue, with the rationale that actually their work was at the cutting edge of collection studies. And they variously looked at, one of them looked at obsession, one of them looked at the implications of collecting clothes worn by trans people in museums when museums' classification systems are divided into binary genders. Another did a lot of oral testimony with 3 women who'd got dress collections and explored what motivated them to collect. And often it was really quite sad, you know, sort of like for a childhood they'd never had, for a cruise they might never go on. And another found a completely extraordinary seller on eBay and buyer, and she collected the stories of the people who were selling the clothes. So it was a collection of words rather than a collection of objects. And now this woman has started to collect objects, and her choice of objects is determined by the stories that accompany those objects. So for my essay, I went to interview Kerry Taylor, and while I was interviewing Kerry Taylor, she told me that I had to meet this man called Alastair Peebles, who she told me collected historical dress worn by boys, and who is erudite and deeply reflective about his own collecting practices. And unbelievably, 20 minutes later, Alastair walked in. So I got Alastair to come and do some teaching. So this is Alastair in my class last Friday. He's come in, he's got the most extraordinary collection of historical boys' clothing. And what's really special about it, it isn't just elite clothing, which is less hard to obtain. It's quite working dress, moleskin, fustian, just completely wonderful. So Alasdair has come, I interviewed him for the article. He's come in and taught the students, and then we've decided we're going to make a small exhibition of his clothes. So again, it's that thing where your work is interfacing the teaching, the writing, and the curating. Alasdair knows that I love perished objects. And so he came with this gift of 2 shoes. I've just photographed one. Absolutely perished 18th century shoe for my teaching collection. What he didn't know was that I run a 2-day workshop called Collecting, Telling Stories with Objects. And I've done this workshop for my students continuously. I've also been asked to do it by the British Council in Tbilisi and Moscow. And I ask all the participants to turn up on the day with 4 single shoes, absolutely any shoes. And then I read them a piece of text from my Bible, which is Gaynor Kavanagh's Dream Spaces. And Gaynor Kavanagh writes about this man, this museum, and they discovered a shoe, and the shoe was quite ordinary. And the curator, a long time ago, Chris, had time, and went to interview the person who gave this seemingly ordinary shoes. And the man said that he used to go dancing with his wife, and his wife loved dancing. He hated dancing, and when she died, he thought, I'm never going to wear these again. And he gave them to the museum, and that's one of the reasons that people give dress to the museum, because it retains its meaning. So I read them this piece, I put them into groups, and then I don't give them a choice. I'm very low-tech. I fold up on a piece of paper a different museum remit, and I split them into groups, and they might have to make an exhibition for a royal palace, for a children's museum, for a local museum by the sea. I change the venues all the time. And using this bunch of shoes, they have to create a narrative around the objects that fits the visitor profile of the type of museum that I've given them. And they all look really perplexed to start with. But at the end of 2 days, they come up with these completely amazing stories. And the moral of the story is, if you can create a really magical story with a bunch of motley old shoes, like, you know, it's heaven when you go into the museum collection. And so I give them these quotes from Susan Pearce. I talk to them about different sort of learner types. Some people learn through their ears, through their eyes. Some people learn through physical activity. And I just say to them, you know, think about what the collection policy of your museum is. Who are your users? You know, what are the aims and objectives of your display? How are you going to communicate your curatorial ideas? How do your chosen objects interact with each other? How will you display the shoes? You know, will you display them at eye level? Will you display them on the floor? Will you hint at the clothes that might be worn with them? And on and on. And at the end of the 2 days, they take it in turns to present their exhibition proposal, and they're all staggered by quite how good they are at the end. One of the trips I always used to take the students on is to the Rootstein mannequin factory, and we used to see every stage of mannequin factory, which was incredible. And recently this factory closed, and LCF's now got the most incredible archive of Rootstein mannequins, including Donia Luna on the left, who Cecil Beaton painted white, classic, in the 1970s, and dressed in Jean Muir in the 1971 Cecil Beaton exhibition that Judith and I obsessed about for our book. For their final projects, our students have 3 choices. All of the mark is based on their final project, so we teach them and grade their work, but the final mark is based on their final project. They can do a text-based project. Most of them choose to do a project which is text-based and practice-based, which is developing a hypothetical exhibition, writing a very reflective academic essay about their decision-making process, and a portfolio, which is the sort of portfolio that you take to the museum director to say, you know, this is my exhibition, this is how I'd like to do it. And some of them do a more practice-based component, which involves a higher level of practice and a smaller component of writing. So this year, one of our students, Sari Kim, she took a dress which was from the Talbot Hughes collection, which was a collection of dress worn by an artist that Julia Petrov and I have both studied, that was given to the V&A by Harrods in 1913, which we put in our book. And her mission was to animate dress, to show people what a dress might look like in movement. Now, it's a student project, and the figure that she's got is not the right figure. It's abundantly clear that it's not a historical figure. She doesn't move like a historical figure. But what she achieved is good. So it's the dress. And so this is an MA student, and she's worked out a way of showing what that dress, obviously on a modern figure that doesn't work, but it's a fantastic achievement of what that dress might look like in movement. Judith runs a unit called The Past and Future of Fashion Curating, or something terribly similar to that, and brings in a model maker, which is one of our ex-students called Jenna Rossi-Camus, who just submitted her PhD very recently. And when Judith and I worked on our exhibiting fashion book, we asked Jenna to make a model of the Cecil Beaton exhibition, which was an incredibly complex perspex structure, which was in the main entrance of the V&A. And we kept seeing pictures of it, and we wanted to understand how the various spaces were occupied. So Jenna made us a model, and this is the model that Jenna submitted for her final project, MA. And on the left is a model made by a student who's never ever made a model before. Her name's Annabelle van der Meijden, and she's doing an exhibition about fashion and ballet, which is timely because Patricia Mears here is also doing a big exhibition on fashion and ballet. And so, having never made a model before, she demonstrated her ideas in 3 dimensions, making this model. And it's such a simple solution, but so effective, she just put tulle on matchsticks. And in a very different way, another student, Wen B, used Photoshop Fix and Mix to dress the mannequins and selected paintings and garments in 2D space to present the ideas for her exhibition, which was looking at the interface between modern art and fashion. We used to run a unit, Judith ran it, where the students had to stage an exhibition. The students at MFIT have the most incredible resources. They have a proper budget, a proper gallery, and they can stage an exhibition, which you can see here, which is just wonderful. We thrive on the opposite end of the spectrum, which is absolutely no money, no venue. And the brief used to be to the students that they had to work together as a team, they had to devise their own roles, come up with an exhibition idea, and it could be hypothetical. But somehow, every single year, through being completely tenacious, they found a space, and not only did they find a space, quite often they had drinks supplied, and once even served by waiters. So this was one project that really always captured my imagination. It was called the White Dress Project. And one of the students had formerly been head of the Royal School of Needlework, and they went to the archive at LCF and found a basic paper pattern, and Rosie showed the students how to make multiple copies of this dress. And then they exhibited the same dress in various ways. So sort of Christian Boltanski-like, on the doormat as you walk in, and of course no one wants to stand on it. They did it the classic way in the case, upside down, in multi-sensorial ways so that you could put your hands through holes in the wall and feel it. I think Jenna made a model. This is with 0 budget, like not even 50p. So this was an extraordinary achievement. Another year, they really, really struggled to find a venue. And you can't start the exhibition really until you've got the venue. And it was one of the times that we really thought this actually might not happen. And at the last minute, they found an empty police station on the outskirts of London, and they did this absolutely beautiful exhibition, which was all about translucency. And you looked through the windows of the police cells, and you looked in the cells, and these are the various installations that they put in. And Rosie, one of the students who you can see here, Taylor Davis in the blue sweater, she was head of the Royal School of Needlework, and she left to come and do our MA by Independent project because she'd been given this mantua to work with, and like many 18th century mantuas, it had been cut up, it had been adapted and remade in the 19th century. And she just wanted a sort of like a year out to obsess on this mantua. So this day we ran a one-day workshop for Rosie, and we brought in specialists like Joanna Marshner from the Royal Palaces, Philip Sycas, who's a very clever textile specialist, and we had a day where Rosie presented the pieces of the mantua, and we talked about the different strategies of how you might interpret it academically and how you might display it in a curatorial context. I'm always looking on eBay for things. If I'm a curator, my desire to collect is sort of thwarted, but when I'm not responsible for a collection, I have a voracious hunger to find nice things. And I became obsessed with this illustrator called Xavier Sager. When I was working with Judith, Judith asked me to help find some images for the Simone handbag museum she designed. I can't find anything much out about this illustrator, but I absolutely love his work. It's women hurtling through Paris on roller skates in about 1912, and there was a whole set for them for sale, and it was 3 figures, and I couldn't justify buying it. And in the end, Shona, one of our students, said that she was going to do an exhibition at Somerset House, and I could buy them and exhibit them. And then another colleague did a project in a prison, I'm going to have to move fast, where she devised, Alison Maloney, she got a single cabinet, got 7 curators to exhibit in it, and she took them into places where people can't go out to see exhibitions. So it was women prisoners, people with mental health problems, and people with dementia. And we went in and we taught the women, and we asked them to bring in an object and to photograph that object and to write a caption for that object. And it was a shocking and moving and profoundly extraordinary day. And so you can read what they said. It just was... one of them said that the one thing you can do in prison is wash your trainers all the time, so she has sparkling white trainers. I'm going to have to move fast. And then all of the shows were exhibited in a charity shop. One of them was Jacob Moss, who was one of our former students, who's now the curator at the Fan Museum in London. This is a student who's doing a PhD with us, who formerly did an MA called Antonis Dikos, and he's looking at the implications of gender-neutral fashion in museum contexts, and did this pitchfork display. This is 2 of our former students' final degree shows, so they do get an opportunity to display. Then on the left is Sophia Hedman, who Chris mentioned earlier, and on the right is CSA, who we all know is going to speak here today. And then this was just to make the point that lots of our students go on to do PhD level study. I've got 8 PhD students, and they variously undertake text-based, a bit like the MA, text-based projects, practice-based or practice-led. And we're really specialising in doing the practice, curatorial practice PhDs, which very, very few universities offer. And, these are the sorts of places that our students have obtained employment. We've got a very high success rate for our students. And just, I've got 2 final slides. One is I take them to a place called Contemporary Wardrobe to see a man called Roger Burton, who's got the most amazing collection of everyday popular culture and subcultural clothes. And I met Roger just before I did the street style exhibition at the V&A, and he did this incredible exhibition called Viva la Punk on body bags, showing the punk clothes. And he's going to work with me and with some of our students on a project we're doing this year, which is to mark the 25 years of the street style exhibition I curated in 1994. Thank you.